Hello everybody, my name is Ian McLaughlin and I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I want to talk about some really amazing progress in the world of prostheses. And something cool about this specific article is that the innovations and the progress that have both been published in a very highly regarded scientific journal, they've also been published in a popular press outlet called Stat News. And by the way, if you're unfamiliar with Stat News and you have any interest in science, biomedical science, I highly recommend checking it out. They're the best outlet covering biomedical science right now. So we're talking about prostheses today. And in case you're unfamiliar with what that term means, it refers to the use of an artificial device to compensate for the loss of a part of the body. You can see that this runner here has those honestly kind of cool looking prosthetic blades to enable her to run very, very effectively. In fact, some assessments of the comparisons of runners with these prostheses to runners without them suggest that there are actually some competitive advantages due to the mechanical properties of the blades themselves. And so this was a debate that was going on like a decade ago. And because of the specific people involved in the debate, it sort of veered off in an unrelated direction. But anyways, the notion that prostheses might actually deliver superior human performance is a discussion that I find very fascinating. I don't think it's entirely controversial to suggest that there is a universe where that might be a viable prospect. That, however, is not a topic for today. So today we're talking about some remarkable progress that's been made towards developing prosthetic devices that deliver some sort of added functionality, some increased sophistication. And so this is a team based out of MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the best hospitals in the country and the world, and Harvard Medical School. Leading biomedical institutions, right? And this is the kind of innovation that we sort of dream might result from the collaboration between engineers and biologists. People, have confronted the loss of limbs for a very long time, of course, right? Particularly when people suffer the loss of a limb due to a traumatic accident or like a wartime incident. Modern humans have had to confront radical changes in their physiologies immediately. While it might seem like losing a limb is difficult enough, the way that our nervous system evolved makes the loss of a limb even more disruptive than just the loss of physical capabilities, right? Muscles do more than just enable us to, move and, pick things up and put them down, right? They most definitely do that, obviously, and they do that very effectively. But there's more to muscle than just moving things. So our nervous system is an important, part of our musculature. Not only because, our central nervous system controls the movement of our muscles, but because our nervous system depends upon the changes that occur in our muscles. And so this is one of those things that comes completely naturally to you, right? One of those things that you never really think about, right? But is incredibly complicated when you think about, the level of coordination that's necessary for me to do something as simple as, picking this bottle up, right? So how do you know, how much force you need? How do you know how to contract your muscles just right to lift something like a cup or a pen or something? How do you know you're not just gonna catapult it into the ceiling or throw it through the window? Our muscles are more complicated than just lifting things up and down, right? They not only receive instructions from our brain to do that, they also provide feedback to our brain in real time all the time. And so, you're lifting something up and you pretty much immediately know how heavy it is, as well as how much force you need to exert to lift it, right? We're not always perfect, of course. Sometimes you pick something up that's way lighter than you expect and you're like, whoa, okay. But you very rapidly calibrate, right? And so, assuming we're not talking about like a toddler, right? But we very rapidly figure out the correct amount of force that's appropriate to accurately handle, any given object without launching it into the air or damaging our bones by trying to lift something that's way too heavy. And so, it's actually kind of interesting to watch this whole system develop in a fledgling human, my 2.5-year-old daughter. While some animals are able to navigate their body just within hours of being born, it takes a very, very long time for humans to figure out the relationship between their bodies and the world. And so, why does it take so long for humans to learn how to walk? Months at the very least. And then when it comes to figuring out how to do things like climbing stairs, jumping, using forks and spoons, all of that takes an absurdly long time when you think about it. And the whole reason it takes so long is that the relationship between the brain and the body is complicated. And so, by the way, that relationship, as we keep growing, changes. And that's why, young adolescents can sometimes be a little awkward, a little clumsy, right? Our limbs and muscles keep changing in size. And so the brain has to continue to recalibrate all those relationships. It's kind of surreal when you think about it, right? That it literally takes years for the brain to become properly calibrated, properly acquainted to the body, right? And so part of the reason that this relationship is so complicated is that there are literally receptors within our muscles that are sensitive to the muscles being used and how they're being used. And so this is one of our senses that isn't really incorporated into the classic 5 senses: smell, touch, taste, vision, and hearing, right? In reality, we have more than 5 senses. Some neuroscientists argue that we have far more than 5 senses, but that whole debate really comes down to semantics at a certain point. But when it comes to our ability to have a sense of how to use our muscles, as well as where our muscles are in space, this is a sensory system that we call proprioception. So proprioception refers to your awareness of where various parts of your body are at any given moment. And so, for example, if you were to close your eyes and keep them closed for like 2 minutes while sitting completely still, and that's kind of like a long time. If you were to keep your eyes closed for 2 minutes and then move your arm in a certain direction, like if you were to lift your hand up towards your face, right, with your eyes closed, you'd know that your arm was up. And most importantly, you don't have to see your arm to know that it's pointing up, right? That's proprioception. If someone were to ask you to close your eyes and touch a finger to your nose, right, and then your ear, and then your chin, the only way that you can manage that is via proprioception. It's the very intimate relationship that our brain has with our body. And so it's our sense of self in space. And the mechanism by which that happens is complicated. And the reason that this is relevant to today's topic is that this whole system is very directly disrupted when we lose a limb. And so I don't know about you, but this was something that I explored quite a bit when I was a kid because I was absolutely terrible at falling asleep. Ever since basically I was a teenager. I don't know about you, but I can sort of even see kind of like a shadow or a ghost of my hand, right, in front of my face, with the lights out and my eyes closed and everything. I haven't seen any actual research that explores why that might be, why you might be able to sort of know where your hand is, almost have a visual experience of it despite your eyes being closed. And it'd be fun to kind of speculate as to why that might happen, if it is actually happening at all. But anyway, so our ability to completely to competently move our bodies, around without access to the most dominant sensory system, vision, relies very heavily on this sensory system of proprioception. This network of receptors through our muscles, through our tendons, and our joints that keeps our brain updated regarding what all of those things are doing at any given moment. And so, like all of our sensory systems, there are also illusions of the proprioceptive system. So one of the stranger ones is called the Pinocchio illusion. So this is where if you sit behind a friend who doesn't mind you touching their face, and you wear a blindfold, spend a fair bit of time stroking your friend's nose while also stroking your nose, right? Your own nose. You can start to perceive your nose as being gigantic, right? Like Pinocchio. There's another way to make this illusion happen, which involves using something that vibrates on your arm to sort of confuse the nervous system. But the point is that this system, just like all of your sensory systems, the proprioceptive system, it can be tricked. And unlike some of our other sensory systems, this system is always on, right? It's constantly updating the brain as to where the body is and what the body's doing. And so I'm sure you can imagine that this system would be radically affected by something like the loss of a limb or an amputation, right? All of those receptors that the brain grew up and developed with, right? Constantly listening to the signals from all of them, all those receptors are now gone. But it's not like the receptors said, adios, we're out of here, right, before they left, right? It's a far more abrupt departure. And while, part of the brain rationally knows that the arm is no longer there, right? You know that the limb is gone. That entire system of proprioception has no way to immediately adapt to the loss of all of those signals, right? And so as a result, there could be a kind of strange, as well as potentially very distressing and painful effect, right? And so, for example, you might have heard of a condition called phantom limb syndrome, or phantom pain, right? So this is the perception of the presence of a limb despite its absence. And so, of course, the proprioceptive system is just one of the many, many sensory systems that are present in our limbs, right? Heat, cold, pressure, itchiness, proprioception, right? As well as, and this is where it becomes particularly unfortunate and disruptive, as well as pain, Okay, and so in other words, not only is someone adapting their lives to the sudden loss of a limb, but they can also feel a persistent sense of pain, or even something like an itch that quite literally cannot be scratched. Right? Think about how maddening that would be. You rationally know that the limb isn't there, but nonetheless, the sensations persist, right? And so phantom pain is a whole topic unto itself, because it is very interesting, and we don't know precisely why it is that it can occur or why it is that it persists, but it absolutely demonstrates that the relationships between our brains and our bodies are far more complicated than simply the body being the vessel that moves the brain, right? There's a constant, fully integrated and reciprocal relationship between the two, between the brain and the body. And when that relationship is substantially altered or incorrectly calibrated, the outcomes can be profoundly distressful. However, just like our other sensory systems, similarly, to how there can be, illusions for all of those sensory systems, and they can be tricked and stuff, our sensory systems can also adapt to new circumstances. They can grow to perform in ways that they normally wouldn't have, or they didn't strictly evolve to. So that brings us to some of the innovations that this group is bringing to the biomedical table today, right? So first of all, and this is actually something I discussed years ago at this point, like in 2017, but the whole world of amputation, like the way that the actual surgery itself is performed, it really hasn't changed all that much for quite a long time, like over 100 years, basically since the Civil War in the United States. But a while back, this same team, developed a novel way by which this surgery can be performed, and that technique is called agonist-antagonist myoneural interface, or AMI. And so here's that original publication. So the fundamental motivation underlying the application of AMI, this surgical procedure, is actually to set someone up to be far more likely to be able to interact with a prosthetic in a far more intuitive way. Right, in a way where it can actually begin to feel quite a bit more like an actual, totally integrated part of the body, rather than feeling more like a cane or a crutch or something that's not really part of the body, but still obviously very useful. And so this is still a pretty new procedure. Something like only 20 people have ever undergone this procedure. And so I've included a link to an explanation of what it's like to undergo this procedure by someone who has, named Lexi Bader. So this is Lexi. And so, as you can see by the mask she's wearing on the bottom, she underwent this procedure fairly recently, right? And so in her case, she underwent the procedure due to a condition called complex regional pain syndrome, which is a condition where there's this sustained pain and inflammation after somebody's had an injury. It used to go by different names, reflex sympathetic dystrophy and causalgia. But basically, it's a condition where that sensation of pain that someone experiences after something as innocuous as just like bumping into something, right? Or someone poking them. There's this like sort of exaggerated pain reaction and inflammatory reaction, which clearly would be pretty seriously distressing. And so fundamentally, the premise of this procedure is, so here's an image from that original article in 2017. And it explains this AMI procedure. And they're simplifying the whole concept here, right? But the whole procedure is based on the relationship that complementary muscles have with each other. And so, think about biceps, right? Your biceps enable you to move your arm in a specific way, right? By picking things up, bringing them closer to you, and then think about your triceps. They enable you to move your arm in the opposite direction, right? To extend it, make it long, and then also push things away from you. Those are your triceps. They're on the opposite sides of the same bone, right? Bicep, tricep. And so, whenever you contract your arm at the elbow, bringing your hand towards your body, your bicep contracts. It becomes smaller. And so for that to even be possible, the triceps has to cooperate, right? And similarly, when you fully extend your arm, making it as long as possible, your bicep also has to cooperate. And by cooperate, I mean relax. And so, if you look at this little diagram of the muscle, specifically under number 2, if you can see it in the middle there, that's what that figure is showing, right? One muscle is contracting and getting smaller, right? That's the agonist muscle. For that to happen, the other muscle, the complementary muscle, stretches, right? And relaxes, giving the contracting muscle the space and freedom to get shorter. That's the antagonist, right? The agonist and antagonist. And so it's kind of wild to think about how complicated and like perfectly choreographed that all has to be for you to do something as simple as pick up a bottle of water and take a sip, right? It's just totally natural, one muscle is contracting, the other one's relaxing. It's not like you're commanding those things to happen. It just happens. You've probably never even thought of that at all, right? It's just totally natural. It's kind of cool. There's actually a method of stretching that's also based on this whole complementary muscle relationship, right? The agonist-antagonist muscle relationship. And it's called reciprocal inhibition stretching, which is also sometimes called active stretching in the fitness community. Same thing, right? The idea is that if you want to stretch one muscle, you keep its complementary muscle, its opposite, its antagonist muscle, in mind as well, right? So you're not only focusing on one muscle. So let's stretch our triceps, right? Normally you just do something like this, right? This kind of a situation. And it helps, right? It definitely stretches the triceps for sure. That's called static stretching, right? You're just stretching it out. With reciprocal inhibition stretching, or stretching using the same fundamental premise as the AMI surgical procedure, right? You're actually going to actively contract your bicep while stretching your triceps, right? So it's a little strange. But because of the neurophysiological relationship between these muscles, your brain actively inhibits your triceps while your bicep is contracting. Just like that, this simplified cartoon of, muscles, right? Which enables you to achieve an even greater stretch as a result, because the brain is inhibiting, is actively relaxing your tricep, or your bicep, right? I'm sorry, actively relaxing your triceps while you're contracting your biceps, right? So it's kind of cool, right? Pretty useful. And so that's the fundamental concept here. And that concept is what drove this team to develop an improved surgical procedure, right? And the major benefit to this surgical procedure at the end of recovery is that the person's nervous system is in a significantly better position to have a largely intact nervous system following the procedure. So instead of having the muscles severed, right, just very simple severing procedure, instead of that, such that the agonist-antagonist muscle pairs, like the relationship between the bicep and triceps, are still able to interact with one another, right? Instead of just they do a little bit of surgical magic and enable that relationship to be sustained, and so they can interact with one another still. And so here's a quote from the senior author on that initial publication, which is linked below, the 2017 article, where they demonstrated AMI surgery. So, quote, "Using this framework, the patient will not have to think about how to control their artificial limb. When a patient imagines moving their phantom limb, signals will be sent through nerves to the surgically constructed muscle pairs. Implanted muscle electrodes will then sense these signals for the control of synthetic motors in the external prosthetic. We think that because the brain is so good at remapping and it's so plastic, it will quickly adapt to knowing how much it has to contract each muscle graft for natural prosthetic control." End quote. So in other words, that's really cool. So in other words, the team is basically taking, that source of significant suffering, right? Phantom limb syndrome. And, for a really substantial proportion of people, they're taking it and they're making it an asset, right? Enabling people to move, to more effectively, interact with a prosthetic. And so without this augmentation of the surgical procedure, without that AMI procedure, people who undergo an amputation have no way to have their proprioceptive system meaningfully interface with the prosthetic. And without that system, they have to visually focus on the movement of the prosthetic to precisely control the subtler, more precise movements in something like an arm or a hand. And so, by the way, that can be extraordinarily tricky. It takes a long time to learn how to use a prosthetic device. And so the way they get this to work is by making sure that whole agonist-antagonist, that whole reciprocal inhibition relationship between muscles, they're making sure that those relationships are intact. And so, I don't have to watch my own arm, right, to lift this bottle to my mouth. I can rely entirely on my proprioceptive system. Certainly one of those things that you take for granted, until there's a problem with it. But anyway, so this team is basically exploiting the fact that we're even capable of experiencing phantom limb syndrome, phantom pain, and using it to our advantage when it comes time for a particularly advanced prosthetic device to be used. So that brings us to the wonderful progress that this team in Massachusetts has made. So yeah, there it is, great. So one of the interesting things that this team demonstrated is when someone is placed in an FMRI, basically like a giant device that can reveal which parts of the brain are consuming energy over time as a kind of proxy for which parts of the brain are becoming active, moment to moment, right? That's what FMRI can demonstrate. When they placed people who had lost limbs in an FMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, when they placed them in an FMRI and then they asked these folks who had lost limbs to move their phantom limbs, there was activity in the part of the brain that would normally be recruited by that proprioceptive system if the limb was still there. And so, the proprioceptive system, the system that updates the brain on where various parts of our body are. So in other words, despite the absence of that limb, it was purely the phantom limb that was producing those neuronal reactions within the brain that would normally depend upon the presence of the limb. So when it comes to this project, the brain seemed like it's absolutely ready to accept that sensory input once again, that proprioceptive sensory information, right? And if when a limb is lost, the surgical procedure is performed in just precisely the right way that preserves those physiological relationships between muscles, agonist-antagonist, reciprocal inhibition. An advanced prosthetic device might very well be able to deliver just that. And so just to give you a sense of how advanced this device can be, here's a video demonstrating a very, very early stage of the prosthetic that can interface with an intact proprioceptive system. Okay, and so you can see here, this gentleman is literally controlling the prosthetic hand purely via a mechanism that's detecting activity in part of his arm that would ultimately connect to the prosthetic, even opening and closing fingers by purely thinking about doing so naturally, right? Just as naturally as we do. And so, at this point, the limitations are in enabling finer control of the subtler movements of our hands, right? One of the glories of human evolution is our hands. The subtler movements that our hands can perform, right? Getting finer control of those, that's very, very tricky. And so, by the way, this gentleman was, or is, a veteran of combat in Iraq, and he was severely injured in an explosion from an IED in 2005. And so I recommend checking out that stat article, that top one, the Popular Press one, that describes his experience in greater detail. But he had been confronting chronic, sustained pain in his right hand, which was still intact. Well, it wasn't completely intact, but it was still there. But it was severely injured. But still largely intact. And also, the hand that would ultimately interface with this prosthetic, right? He was chronic, inescapable pain, right? And he had undergone multiple surgeries to address this pain, which never ultimately panned out, never ultimately successfully addressed the pain. And so his physicians brought up the possibility of amputation to, address that persistent pain. And, pretty significant thing, to which he had to commit, of course, amputation. And then just 2 months later, he started working with this novel prosthetic. So here's another video, same person. And so you can see this gentleman practicing, learning how to control individual fingers and the tilt of the wrist by moving them by volition alone. And that's what makes this whole surgical procedure, as well as that prosthetic device itself, the control of the prosthetic device is controlled entirely by the same kinds of thoughts that those of us who are fortunate to not have lost limbs that we experience when we move our own hands. And just as importantly, his persistent pain, right, the entire motivation to undergo this procedure in the first place, that persistent pain was also gone. But yeah, so, of course, there's a learning process. He's still learning how to use it, while the brain becomes acquainted with its new limb. Which, by the way, and I imagine a lot of people don't realize this, but we all undergo precisely that process with our brain learning to control its body, right? Watching my 2.5-year-old daughter learn to calibrate her own movements to achieve various goals, right? Everything from learning things as simple as, like, learning to turn her head in the direction of someone who's talking, right? Something we all kind of take for granted, but you have to learn how to do that, how to coordinate all of that, all that sensory information, and then literally the musculature, right? And then, but then also to learning how to turn her body over. That's like one of the landmarks as an infant is growing, right? Is like being able to turn. It takes kind of a long time for them to figure it out. It's kind of weird. But then to walking, to manipulating a fork and spoon, to running and jumping. My daughter just mastered jumping. She's super into jumping and skipping right now. Anyways, all that takes quite a bit of time. It's not as easy as we all, I think, most adults kind of perceive them as being. And all of that time is devoted to growing, literally physically growing and refining the exact same parts of the brain that are recruited when someone who'd undergone this surgical procedure, the AMI, agonist-antagonist myoneural interface surgical procedure, AMI. When someone's undergone that procedure, they also have to undergo this learning process. The same kind of thing that we all have done at one point or another. So in the stat article, the top one, the journalist also retells a story from another person who'd undergone that same exact AMI surgical procedure, which I found very fascinating. So here's a quote from the article. One One AMI amputee was hiking recently while wearing a standard prosthetic and stepped into a creek. He later described having the sensation of water flowing over his prosthetic foot, even though it had no way to perceive that. He trusted or embodied his prostheses to more than someone who doesn't have that phantom sensation, right? So in other words, like, despite the complete absence of any sensory receptors that would normally be required to be aware of water flowing over skin, right? Because there is no skin there. This person's brain was perceiving that sensation nonetheless, almost certainly because he'd undergone that unique surgical procedure, right? That surgical procedure that was pioneered by the same group that is demonstrating this prosthetic device. And so, an experience like that reveals quite a bit about the nature of those sensory systems, right? How they work, and that they don't rely entirely on, the sensory receptors themselves. So, for example, right, it's a remarkable demonstration of how important the physiological relationships between these muscles, right, as well as the nervous system that controls them, are to the way that we perceive the world and how we move through it. And so this team is currently working on improving and refining the capabilities of these prostheses, right, enabling finer control of its movement using a bunch of really interesting engineering tricks, like using magnets and stuff, small magnets. But anyways, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited and grateful that people are working on, developing such sophisticated devices. And I can't help but, imagine a future where, once this technology achieves a certain level of progress, I can't help but wonder what it'll be like when there are prosthetic devices that are unambiguously and overtly superior to the parts of the human body that they're intended to replicate or replace, right? From what I can tell, we're not too far away from that state of affairs. All right, that's what I have for you today. If you dig this kind of discussion, things like neuroscience, biomedical science, and so on, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you next week.